everybody. Welcome to Primetime at the BU Library. Primetime at BU Library's mission is to encourage lifelong learning beyond the classroom for the entire Bethel community, and is a collaboration of the Friends of the Bethel University Library and many offices on campus. On Tuesday, February 21st, as the Bethel Theater Department stages its production of the Tony Award-winning satirical musical Urinetown, Wayne Russa, Mark Bruce, and Meg Zahn will offer insights into how satire both entertains and educates at a presentation entitled Urinetown, Naughty or Nice. Today, we welcome Jon Steen as he presents about a study abroad experience entitled Capture and Trade, the Slave Castles of West Italy.
Well, thank you. Welcome to this little presentation spiel. I'm going to talk about this, and just to be honest, this isn't really the happiest subjects to ever really talk about, but I just do want to talk about this because it is vital to the human experience. It is something that honestly affects all of us in some way, even if we realize it or not. So I'm just going to start off just by going over the program that I went with real quick, and then I'm going to get to the actual details. So I went to a program called School for International Training, and this is the group I went with, so they're all pretty cool. This is what SIT is all about. It's about strengthening intercultural understanding, exploring critical global issues, fostering relationships worldwide, transforming lives, experiential learning, and it's a field-based study. It's just all these things you're not really just going and visiting a bunch of places, you're really just living with the culture, you're interacting with the people, and you're having a good time. That's what SIT is all about. And you know, there's a lot of off-campus programs, and there's some things that make it unique. It's the first-hand exposure of just being there and being in the culture. It's the direct cultural interaction, just chilling with people, taking trojos and doing other crazy stuff with average people. And then you see the other side of tourism. You see what some of the touristy things can do for the people of Ghana themselves, both positive and negative. I'm not going to get into that in this one, but if you want to talk about it some other time, I'm more than happy to. And then living instead of visiting, I kind of talked about that. I mean, I did a homestay as well in the middle of this program, so that was also kind of fun. And then the last month, I'll talk about this in a moment, we had our own independent study projects, and I ended up writing a 36-page research paper, so that was pretty sweet. But I was living on my own in the capital city of Accra, so that was crazy. And this is what the program looks like. There's 4 aspects. One part is the language study. I went through a language Fanti, and I remember a little bit of it, but I also learned some Tree as well, so that was cool. Then there's a short little research study prep for the independent study project, which I just talked about. And then there's the main focus of the class. That's a seminar period. And what my program was called was the Origins of African Identity. And so we looked at everything under the sun. It was kind of an overview of everything. But one of the things we talked about was the slave castles. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Just to give you perspective on where it is, here's Ghana. Accra was the capital, and I was based about here in Cape Coast. I also traveled to Benin as well. I went all over the country of Ghana. I'll show you some pictures of that in a moment. And here's Ghana itself. It's kind of cool. Like you can see, like Volta, which is the largest largest artificial lake in the world, created by the dam at Akosombo. But yeah, okay. So I'm going to start here. Just looking at the African story of slavery. This area is up in the north, and while I want to start here. You can see the models? Yeah. This area up here is where most of the people who were put into the slave trade came from. And so they would have been kind of either POWs, or it would have been just trade. It could have been this idea of kind of the servitude of, like, you owe someone money, and so you can lend out your children for slave or to work for someone else. That was kind of taken in context. And what would happen is that they would end up being marched all the way down from this northern area, or from Burkina, all the way down to a place right about here. This place is called Asan Mansa, where my mouse is pointing. And then from there, they would be sold to the castles at Cape Coast and Elmina. Cape Coast is here, and Elmina is just farther down. I'll show you more pictures, but this is what the north looks like. It's all savanna. The south is all foresty area. It's kind of sweet looking. I didn't put any pictures of that, but there's this perception by most Ghanaians that were living at the time that the people from the north were this inferior kind of people. And so then when the trade was happening on the African coast, there was really not a lot of concern about humanitarian issues, because they were seen as inferior, as less than normal people. So there's that aspect. And then they would be marched down to this place. This is called, this is Asan Mansa. This is about 2 miles away from it, just north. And this is a place that they've now called the Slave River. After being marched down, it would take, I mean, it's about the same distance as being marched from above Bemidji to, say, Austin, Minnesota. Pretty long way. They'd be doing it on foot. It's incredibly hot. It's really hot. And they wouldn't have showered. They'd be chained down, so they'd have like 30 pounds of, chain with them that they're forced to go with. And so, before they would be sold at Austin Mounso to these slave castles at Elmina and Cape Coast, they'd have to be bathed in this river here. And then right behind where I took this picture, there's kind of this open area in the trees where it would have been the sun. They're basically just let out to dry like you would if you were doing laundry. And so after that, they'd be marched a short little distance down here, and then the Europeans who were in Cape Coast and Elmina at the time, whether it be English or Portuguese or Dutch, would have come up here, kind of had a good time. Not really had a good time, but they would just come up here, and this is where they would buy people to bring to their castles, and then from the castles they'd be sent to the ships out. So this is a kind of a trading area, about 30 miles north of Cape Coast. And now we're going to get to the castles. I'm just going to look at 3 castles. I'm going to look at the Elmina Castle, Cape Coast Castle, and then the Portuguese fort in, it's Portuguese fort in Ouida, Benin. But this is Elmina. This is looking at one of the female slave cells. Yeah, you can kind of see it's just, you can see the brick floor and all that not so fun stuff. And this would have been the area. This would have been a courtyard around the female cells. So you can see up here there'd be cells, over on this side there'd be cells, and over here there were cells. And this is looking up top from the governor's, the person who's running the castle. He would look down here. He'd be living up there with his family, or other people or whatever. But every once in a while, when let's say he had to blow off some steam, he would go out here. He'd have all the female captives assembled in this area. He would look down, and he would point out one that he would want to rape. I'll just say it that way. I'll just be blunt. But he would choose them, and then off to the right of this picture, there'd be this kind of secret passageway up to the top. And after the governor did what he did, he wasn't the only one who had to blow off steam. And so oftentimes what would happen is when she was being brought back down, the other soldiers that would be guarding that area or whatever would also blow off steam. So there was that, and then they'd be thrown back in the cells, and it's pretty messy, but it's what happened. Yeah, this is also not fun to look at. Obviously, this doesn't have a good connotation to it, but this would be a place for what I would call the rebellious people's cell. If there were people that could be inciting people to try and rise up against the castle, what would happen to them is they would just be put in here and locked and left there. No food, no water, no light. There's one of these in Elmina, there's another one in Cape Coast, and in Cape Coast, I walked in there and they actually closed the door behind us. And that was really freaky. I really don't have any other way to say it. But also one thing in Cape Coast, I was looking at the walls and you can see these teeth marks on the wall. You can see these, all these pretty horrendous things that are going on there. And it's just kind of, ugh. I don't know how else to explain that. And this is also an important concept in the slave castles. This is called the Door of No Return. This would have been the last place that most people from Africa would have last seen Africa before they'd be taken to a smaller boat to the bigger boats and then across the ocean on the infamous Middle Passage. They'd be kind of going through this intricate network, and all of a sudden they'd be going through this Elmina was a very skinny door, but I think they used to actually have tourists go through that door for that experience. But they realized that a lot of the people couldn't actually fit through that door because it was really narrow. But it's kind of eerie because what they'd be doing is they wouldn't feed them as much as they should, and so they can actually fit through that door. Now this is Cape Coast. You kind of see how it looks. Pretty, white looking, I guess. And this is inside one of the male cells here. It's a little hard to see, but you can tell that there's a couple of little lights up towards the top. You can get light in, but you can kind of see right down the middle here, there's this tiny little trench. That would be a urinal. And the side I was standing on was slightly lower, and so everything would drain down to this side. And so on this far end here is where people slept. And then in the corner here is basically where all the poop would be. So they were basically living in the same areas as their excrement and sleep in there, and it's brick, not very comfortable. So that's Cape Coast for you. So now I'm going to hop over to Benin real quick. I only spent a couple days there, but I'm going to look here at a place called Ouida. I actually really like Benin. I'll talk about that maybe some other time. But this is the Portuguese fort. I can't pronounce things in Portuguese, so I can't say the actual name of it. But this is the governor's house, and it's to think about this compound, it's kind of like you have the square in the middle, and then there's these two wings on the outside. And this would be in the middle looking at the governor's mansion in the place. And then this is one of the sides. This is the equivalent to the cells in the castles of Cape Coast and Elmina. This is where people would have been kept for the trade. So they'd be kept outside. And one thing I noticed about Benin very quickly is that in Benin, there's a couple of rivers that come out there, and so naturally there are a lot of mosquitoes. And with mosquitoes comes malaria. And I can tell you from personal experience, malaria isn't that great. Yeah, I had malaria. Oh well. But basically, it happened. But basically, they'd be forced to sleep out here until they were marched a couple miles down to the coast. On the other side, the kind of parallel to it is is an experimental garden. This would have been a place just for the person living in the governor's mansion to just grow what he wanted to. And so you kind of have this eerie dichotomy of slavery on one side and terrible conditions, and then a garden on the other end. And some of these trees are 200, 300 years old, and so they would have been planted by the people who were actually doing it, which is kind of weird. And of course, I don't think God was really behind this, but in the place there was a church. And there was one in Cape Coast as well, and there was one in Elmina. And this one hit me. This one was really tough. This obviously doesn't represent Christ at all. And it's really weird to think about is that in Cape Coast and Elmina, as well as here, is where a lot of missionaries would have stayed because it was safer to be in the castles. And so they'd be staying 2 floors above in pretty nice places above where people were living in cells, or right next to where they were sleeping outside before they're going to be put in the middle passage. So yeah, that one was a tough one to swallow. And Benin is slightly different than the castles in Cape Coast and Elmina and Ghana. Just because the coast itself was not a very safe place to have castles in Ghana, excuse me. But they were right on the edge. I couldn't really get a good picture of it, but if you're at the castle, you can just step outside the door of no return in either one, and then you're right at the ocean. Here you have to walk a couple miles down, and then the smaller boats would come and meet you right on the shore, and then they would take you to the bigger boats that would take you across the ocean. All right, so I want to watch this little video here to kind of talk about the experience of what it's like. I don't know what you guys think about Barack Obama's politics. I don't really care what you think. This isn't about politics. This is actually this is an interview with Anderson Cooper in 2009 before he was president. He was senator at the time, but it really sums up the experience of what it would be like very well. And this is only a part of it, but if you want to watch the entire thing, it's all on YouTube. So here we go.
What must have been the most emotional part of his trip took place here at Cape Coast Castle. This is where enslaved Africans were held before being shipped to the New World, being shipped to America. They were kidnapped from their homes, taken from their villages, ripped from their families. And as soon as they were brought here, the men were separated from the women. To no return, very rich. Hundreds of thousands of slaves were sent.
And on the other end, obviously, there's a sense of what a profound sorrow must have been felt as people were hauled off into the great unknown.
Do you think what happened here still has resonance in America? That the slave experience still is something that should be talked about, and should be remembered, and should be present in everyday life?
Well, I think that the experience of slavery is like the experience of the Holocaust. I think it's one of those things you don't forget about. I think it's important that the way we think about it and the way it's taught is not one in which there's simply a victim and a victimizer, and that's the end of the story. I think the way it has to be thought about, the reason it's relevant is because whether it's what's happening in Darfur, or what's happening in the Congo, or what's happening in too many places around the world, the capacity for cruelty still exists. The capacity for discrimination still exists. The capacity to think about people who are different, not just on the basis of race, but on the basis of religion, or the basis of sexual orientation or gender, still exists. And so, trying to use these kinds of extraordinary moments to widen the lens and make sure that we're all reflecting on how we're treating each other, I think is something that I want my kids to think about, and I want every child to think about.
They say this is the door of return for African Americans who are revisiting Ghana. And I talked to one African American lady yesterday who said that coming here is such a powerful experience that she actually decided to move here. I know you've met with many African Americans who decided to move here. Do you understand? They say that there's a sense of coming home. Do you understand that feeling?
Well, I will tell you, the first time that I traveled to Africa, I think that there is a special sense for African Americans of somehow connecting up with a part of yourself that you might not have even been aware was there. Now, obviously, for me, it was different because I was directly meeting relatives and learning about a father I didn't know. But I do think there's a sense for a lot of African Americans that it's a profound, life-changing experience. The interesting thing, though, is I've met a lot of white Americans who come to Africa and say it was a life-changing experience for them too.
This is the home where everyone comes
from. Yeah, exactly. And there is a powerful sense of tapping into something very elemental about it.
Sure, once you come, you sort of always come back.
Yeah, you do. So, but I do think that the spirit, particularly of a place like Ghana, where for all the difficulties it's still going through, the people are just incredibly open and friendly and welcoming. I think that makes a difference for a lot of people who, maybe African Americans who feel somehow that they never fully belong. And the only thing I would say, though, is there's a flip side to this, which is I know an awful lot of African Americans who come to Africa, are profoundly moved, but also realize how American they are when they're here, and recognize that they could never live here. And that's part of the African American experience. You are, in some ways, connected to this distant land, but on the other end, you're about as American as it gets. In some ways, African Americans are more fundamentally rooted in the American experience because they don't have a recent immigrant experience to draw on. It's that unique African American culture that has existed in North America for hundreds of years.
Yeah, I just wanted to show that because it shows, I think, pretty well how what the African American experience is at the castles and things like that. And he kind of hinted a little bit at the white American experience when they go there. And as a white male going to the castles, it was a very interesting experience for me. Mainly because, just thinking about it, I was going there with 5 African American women in white and 1 Caucasian woman. So it was kind of like this interesting, it was a weird dichotomy just because, being a white male, I would have, if I was back in the day, I would have been almost responsible. I would have been the one doing what happened. And then they were there, and they would have been the one going through the terrible process. And so there was this really interesting, how we can really talk about, how we can move on. But for me, there was this sense of guilt, and there was this sense of shame. And so there was, it's still, even though this is so long ago, the way it's kind of been handled, there's still this feeling of, I'm responsible. And I put these friends of mine through this kind of thing. So it was very surreal in a way. That it was kind of like I was the one doing this to them. I don't know how else to explain it, but So that was very, very interesting, but at the same time, it was really good just to talk about that with them. And from there, we were working on building a reconciled world. And so it was just kind of like we're building off of what's happened. It's hard to move on, because it's honestly, there's pretty terrible. But it's important to talk about these things. It's important to try and, build up from where we were at and try and make our world better and stronger, and that make us more united and more diverse and more understanding of other cultures. And this is the thing, is that you can never forget the past. You can never forget the hurt that has happened. You can never forget any of that. But we can always move forward, remembering what happened. And we can forgive what happened. We can try and do that, and just move on to make a better world. And honestly, as a white American, it's just kind of interesting that one of the girls on the trip, one of the African American girls, said that she still can't forgive white people for what happened. And we talked about it, and I do understand. We talked about we're good friends and all that, but it was just still, it was interesting just to kind of like, she's, even though, a couple generations apart, she still had trouble forgiving. So there's a lot that goes on at these castles. There's a lot that's happened. There's a lot of feeling and emotion that runs through it. But we can move now in a place with greater awareness to understand how we can better our world. That's the main point I want to get to. So a lot of this lecture, or this talk, I guess, has been pretty negative. So I want to end rather positively. There are elephants there. These are wild elephants. Pretty awesome. So I guess that's all for now.
Did you have a zoom lens, or were you that close?
Don't tell my mom. I was probably about 25 yards away. And we're not supposed to be any closer than 50 yards. So I just kind of remember looking at the elephant. You just kind of stared at it for a second and then just walked away. It's pretty sweet. But that's all I have for now. So if you have any more questions, feel free to talk to me afterwards. And I'd love to talk about it, because I only hinted at a few of the things, and there's a ton more stuff that happened. 3.5 months, you can't really explain it in a short amount of time. So thank you for attending, and think about going abroad, because it's pretty sweet.
Are we asking questions?
Oh, we can ask questions, sure.
What did you do your talk then on the slave trade in the castles, or what? Not your talk, but your big paper, 36-page paper.
My 36-page paper. We kind of had the liberty to choose what we wanted to talk about. So I didn't necessarily talk about the slave trade in that. This is just something we went over. Yeah. What I did was I looked at, I did a comparison study between China and the West, and looking at globalization issues in Ghana, specifically Accra, the capital. So I was just kind of defining, like, how are these outside forces interacting with the continent itself and what it's doing to the continent. And I was basically looking to define them as neo-colonial or imperial, which are big terms. But basically, I could say that the West was neo-colonial and imperial, but I couldn't say that China was, which one? Yeah. But either way, it's just kind of like I was looking at these outside forces, and I was seeing that Ghana itself has the ability to let itself develop, but we're not letting them. That's basically what I got to in the end. So if you want me to forward the paper, yeah, it's, I don't know, there's a lot to it, but yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I really appreciate it. It's nice to hear you, an American, go to Ghana and then coming to share your experience. But one of the things that I found really very interesting in your presentation is the role of Christianity there. I think one of the questions that your presentation raises is that people have never understood Christ the same way. Okay? Even today in America, people do not understand Christ the same way. I was amazed recently. I was reading during this campaign that there were some politicians who are evangelical Christians who signed a plate in Iowa here which says that a black person born in the United States, a child born in the United States in 1860 is far better, in a far better condition than a black child born in the United States today. And 1860, you remember, that was just before the Civil War really started. Yeah. So these are Christians. So I can identify with that kind of Christ, to be frank. okay, I cannot identify with that kind of Christ. And I think the real essence of slavery is to deny another person his humanity or her humanity. And so the real issue we have to deal with today, if this is relevant, the presentation is going to be relevant for us, is are there ways that we as Christians today deny other people their humanity? That's the question.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it was very interesting as well going through the experience with, 6 girls who were not Christians as well. Because they would look at what, like that picture of the church inside in the fort in Benin. And, sorry. And it was just kind of like, they would just go, oh, this is Christianity. And I would just go, no, it's not. This is not what it's supposed to be. And so it's a very hard thing to try and reconcile, is that was there. And this is where the Christianity, when it came to Africa, this is how it came through. It came through this other end of the slave trade. So it's weird. But.
My daughter just spent a month in Ghana.
Oh, great.
And one of the impressions she got was how vibrant Christianity was there. She was also traveling with somebody that was an atheist and 2 that were kind of nominally Christian, and they had never seen Christianity practiced in a vibrant way. And when I saw the church there in the castle, I thought, how did Christianity, you talked to the missionaries that were there, how did the vibrant, did you see any understanding of how there got to be a vibrant Christianity that's there today when it came from this compartmentalized Christians who could live without the slaves and then say they were ministers?
Yeah, there's 2 aspects to this. The first one is a blending of Christianity with more traditional African religions. There's a lot more, I would call it spiritism, I guess, in the traditional African religions than there is in Protestant Christianity or Catholic Christianity. But so there's this kind of, like, we have to connect more with, like, the spiritual side of it. So that's where the vibrancy comes from. And as far as where the Christianity was spreading, it's important to remember just where the people were coming from that were being put in the slave trade. They'd be from, I'm going to go back to a map. They'd be from the northern areas. That's where the people would be from the trade. And so the people on the coast itself, here we go. So they'd be coming from here, and they'd be, walked all the way down, and then they'd be taken to the castles. And people on the coast were really seeing people go to the castles, and then they didn't really know exactly what was happening. They just knew that trade was good. And if it's the people from the north that were seen as inferior, they weren't as concerned with what they were about and like the trade that was going through, because in the end they were getting mirrors, they were getting weapons, they were getting ammunition, things like that. So they were really benefiting, the one from Cape Coast or Elmina or Accra, where the castles were at. So that's kind of where the benefit comes from. And so the missionaries would go to those areas, and to this day, the southern end is the Christian part. And if you go up north, it's actually Muslim. It's something like 85% Muslim in the north and like 90% Christian in the south. So I mean, the Christianity that's there is just in the southern areas, and it's really because they didn't really realize exactly what was going on, and also it's a mix with African traditional religions that were over there.
I think she was in the north, 10 of the days. That little place called, you really go a little bit just east, two other directions.
Sorry.
That's where she spent 10 days.
Okay.
So, but it was a Lutheran mission there.
Okay. I mean, there are missions and there are churches that are going up there, but for the most part, it's Muslim. I didn't actually go to that end. I went over to Wa and Tamale, and I saw the elephants right about here, somewhere in there. It's important.
It is good.
So I didn't necessarily go to that end, but excuse me. But yeah, so I mean, there's still traditional religions going on all over the place.
How do you feel your homestay shaped your experience?
I mean, the homestay experience was very enlightening. Unfortunately, me and my homestay family didn't get along very well. It's a long story, but I mean, it really, when you're living with people, when you're living on that side of it, no matter if it's a positive or negative experience, you see what the impact of things like tourism does. I guess I'll just get to that since I have time. But this is weird and it's kind of going off topic now, like from all this. But like where the Cape Coast Castle is in Almeda Castle, most Ghanaians don't choose to go to that place. They choose just to they just say it's there. Oh, it's just there, and they don't really have a connection with it in the past. It's very strange. And so there'll be all these tourists will come in, and then there'll be the Rasta shops outside of Cape Coast Castle, and it'll be funny. The Rastas are hilarious. But so it's just kind of something that's there, and it's not something that really matters to them. So it's really what happens now. There's, I think, like 32 World Heritage Sites on the coast, and only 3 of them are actually being used by Ghana for tourism purposes. But it kind of makes this attitude of it's just something that happened a long time ago, it doesn't matter to us anymore. And then you get African Americans coming there at the same time, and they're having this huge emotional attachment to it. And then the people in Africa themselves are kind of like, well, I mean, that's just what they do. It's all very interesting. So the tourism aspect is very strange, and it's kind of ruining the history of it for people in Ghana. Any other questions?
I was just wondering if you share your major and how you decided how you chose this program.
Yeah, I'm a history major here, and I mean, one thing I'm going to be honest, I get bored with European history and American history. Everyone looks at that. So I was thinking about doing something else completely. So I was interested in Africa, just kind of doing that kind of fun thing. So I went over there thinking I'm going to do something with African history. But now that I've come back, I've had this weird understanding of what history is like in Africa, and our concept is there's not even a word for it in any Ghanaian language or anything like that. Because they see it as more of telling stories in the long run, and just kind of like, they may be based off of what actually happened, but I mean, they're just stories. They're kind of used for the purpose of telling us how to live now, instead of it being historical truth in the long run. So, yeah.
I was just wondering, I know that you've been to Ethiopia before. How was your second time in Africa different from your first? Were they very significantly different? I'm sure, but I mean, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
I actually went with my auntie Dee Dee sitting there.
So be careful what you say.
Be careful. Ethiopia is terrible. No. It is different when I went to Ethiopia, just because I was only there for a week and a half or 2 weeks or so. And it was really just hitting major tourist sites and then spending a week just chilling at a school there. And so, I mean, you got to do cultural interaction when I was in Ethiopia, but I never really experienced what it's like to live there. And that's kind of the big feel I got out of this experience. Any other questions? Or? All right.